the challenges of changing paradigms, because that's going to lead us into how you go about doing it. So I'm not going to go with the dictionary definition of paradigm. I'm going to use my own. So if we think of the way something operates, and the thing could be any system, and we're talking about people systems here, not like computer systems. So a family operates according to a certain set of rules, most of which are unwritten. An individual person has their own personal paradigm. It's easier to see in others, right? If you have a friend who's consistently negative about everything, and every time you try to make a suggestion, he says, oh, that'll never work because of blah, 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 blah. You might think, wow, he's stuck in a particular worldview. I wish there was something I could do to help him get out of that. Does that make sense? So I'm going to call that a one-person paradigm. Right? You could have a family-sized paradigm, a team-sized paradigm, a company-sized paradigm, a country-sized paradigm, a global paradigm, potentially a universal one, I suppose. Our trusted sources say, yes, you could. Thank you. So in this case, we're dealing with a country-sized paradigm, if we're talking about the purpose of Israel. But you're probably dealing with a paradigm on a different scale in whatever change you're trying to create. So if you're trying to transform your family or your company or your neighborhood, I want you to translate what I'm saying into those terms and think, what's the corresponding thing for my example? Does that make sense? So I would say that the paradigm, the system, has many features, but one of the most noticeable from the standpoint of creating change is it's a self-reinforcing system of beliefs. Does that make sense? So that is perceiving the world according to a certain sense of known facts about what's true, and those beliefs color how the people in that paradigm see everything. If you know anything about the brain or you've done much consciousness work, it shouldn't come as a surprise that if you have a belief, all the data that you come to, that comes into you, gets filtered according to that belief. And in general, what the brain does, the brain gets way too much information to process. The amount of data going into your ears and eyes and your other senses is far more than your conscious mind can actually integrate and do anything with. So the brain does a whole lot of filtering according to a lot of criteria. For example, it prioritizes danger pretty high on not being filtered out. If anything looks, smells, or sounds dangerous, that goes right to the top of the priority list. Things that are extremely familiar and not very interesting go to the bottom. Sometimes your spouse can go to the bottom if they keep saying the same things over and over and over enough times, and you just start to tune them out. Right? It's not that you don't love them, your brain has just decided they're uninteresting and low priority. So, see, that's happened to some of you. One of the ways it filters things is according to what you already believe to be true. So if something fits that belief, it passes through the filter. And if it doesn't fit the belief, it gets discarded. And in that way, the belief causes you to perceive a reality that matches the belief. For example, you could have two human beings. They could even be identical twins. And one believes that people are basically good. And the other one believes that everyone's out to get you and they'll take advantage of you, given the slightest chance. Now, not only will they perceive reality in a way that fits those beliefs, the way they behave, because those have those beliefs, will tend to inspire other people to behave according to those beliefs. Right? This person's going to go out and be friendly to everybody, and everyone's going to be friendly back. And this person's going to be constantly suspiciously watching everybody, unconsciously taking advantage of others and doing all these things. And both of them will come back and report that reality was exactly the way they predicted, and the other one is completely insane. Right? You're totally missing the point. Don't you see all the evidence that shows that I'm right and you're wrong? Does this all make sense so far? Yes. Good. So, if we're dealing with a country-sized paradigm, that must mean that there are a bunch of national beliefs that are self-reinforcing in their nature that keep things the way they are. Now, what happens if someone has a belief and you try to convince them they're wrong?
They resist.
They resist. What happens if you do a good job of convincing them wrong and start to give them good evidence?
They resist more.
They resist more. They usually get pissed off if you start to make any progress. What are you doing undermining my reality? Who asked you? So there's a security in that reality, and the reality is self-reinforcing. So anything from the outside that starts to impinge on that belief structure is actually perceived as a threat, especially if it was uninvited, which it usually is. So we have a self-reinforcing belief system that will defend itself if it's impinged on by anything that might alter it, and it will flex and adapt and cleverly try to recreate itself if it gets damaged. It's almost like a living thing, in a way. Like it'll heal. If some stuff comes up and impinges on it, it'll put itself back together. Another thing that people often miss about these paradigms, especially change agents who are trying to change them, is that whatever paradigm is currently functioning is functioning. It's working. Which means that that belief system, however negative it may seem to you from the outside, is actually working for the people who are in it. Perhaps according to a set of criteria that you do not understand or do not share. It might look miserable to you, but they must like it enough to keep doing it. Right? So they're, quote unquote, happily living inside this paradigm and probably haven't invited you to come in and disrupt it. Okay? So, also, if you were to successfully disrupt it, it might stop working. This is another thing that change agents don't think about. Right? We're dealing with a functioning system, and if you successfully disrupt it, you could break it. The assumption many change agents have, it's actually a limiting belief, is that change is good. Well, sometimes change is good, but not necessarily. There's such a thing as making things worse. And there's plenty of examples of well-meaning people making things worse with the best of intentions. This could be you. Good. So, this is all...
Can we interrupt?
Yeah, sure, please.
And also, one of the, what is good and what is bad? And who decides what is good and what is bad? This is also a matter of
If you're asking me about my belief, my own personal
it's
paradigm,
a belief. It's a belief.
In Tim's personal paradigm, good and bad are subjective judgments of the ego, according to the person's own value system and how whatever it is makes them feel. And you and I could have completely different definitions of good and bad. Yours could be obvious to you and mine could be obvious to me, and we could both be convinced that I could be convinced that my good and bad are features of the universe, not things I've made up, and that you're completely wrong, and you could believe exactly the same thing. That's how Tim's paradigm looks at it, but you might have a different one. Good question. I don't personally believe in good and bad in the usual sense.
You're using it a lot. You're using those words. That's
right.
why I asked you to...
Yeah, because I'm speaking into
what
an
you
existing
mean.
paradigm.
Because also change, if we want to change, one can, like, for example, two people in this
Sure,
room.
one person could say that's a good change, and the other person could say it's a bad change. Yeah, sure, absolutely. But I'm speaking about in the judgment of the person creating the change, and in the judgment of the person receiving it. It could potentially be bad for both, even though the intention was good on the part of the person who initiated it. But anyway, you're absolutely right. I have no argument with that whatsoever, but I often use ordinary language to get a point across. Yes?
I want to say something about change, because since it's the topic and you're getting into a little bit more details, in my perception, my personal paradigm, change is happening all the time. So we're not agents for creating the change, but just to facilitate where the change.
Maybe steering it.
Yeah, just suggesting that it's going to steer to some
influence
direction. Yeah, just try to influence it. So it's To me, that's more precise than just...
Yeah, and actually I've run into limiting beliefs around this. This was interesting. When I talked about with companies about finding the higher purpose of companies and the new paradigm of business, and talk about how you can shift the attention off of profit only onto other things. Sometimes some CEOs, more often in Israel than other places, will say, no, 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 no. That's a basic feature of business. You can't change that. That can't be changed. It has to work that way.
That money is the first thing
first
on
and
the
only
ladder?
priority. It has to work that way. Now, and I break it down, I believe, in exactly the way that you said, which is I say it has to work that way. And so that's actually a relatively new belief. 70 years ago, business people didn't believe that. That dates about to the 1980s. I said, does business operate now the way it did 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago? And they're like, no, 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 no. And I'm like, well, it's constantly changing already, so don't tell me I can't change it. All right, never mind. That one goes away fairly easily, but you're absolutely right. Anyone who says it can't change isn't paying attention very closely. Stuff's changing a lot all the time. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's in the same context that actually we are not that fixed as personal individuals as well. I mean, people try new things, they have new ideas, and even though we have our own personal core paradigms, I mean, everybody's here probably not the same person he was or she was, I don't know, 1 year ago, right? 2 years ago?
Even if people don't do work on themselves, if you compare them at 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50, they're pretty different. I mean, there are identity shifts going on.
So how fixed are we?
Not very.
Not at all.
So that's a little bit of a contradiction to like what you said, no? That we have
no, I do believe that even though that's going on, people do have a tendency to perceive themselves as somewhat fixed, not everyone, but many people, and to try to hang on to certain beliefs, in part because they may be uncomfortable or afraid with how much other things are changing and how much they're changing. And it's sort of like a life ring or a security blanket to believe in something that's immutable and fixed and doesn't change. Right? To acknowledge that it's all changing, it's all subjective, I'm changing, it's changing, everything is changing, for many people would be kind of frightening. And I don't blame them. I can definitely empathize with that. I've gotten used to it, but it took a lot of work. Good. Cool.
Sometimes they're not aware of it, right?
What's that?
Not always they are aware of it.
No. And I've had that happen. I've gone through transformations and not realized it. People ask me to describe myself, and I did, and someone who knew me said, "You're not like that at all. You're describing who you were 6 months ago." And I was like, oh. I guess I can't answer your question. I don't know who I am. Good. Okay. So, I don't want to go into too much more detail. The document goes into more, but